Have you ever wondered why silence unsettles a man more than rage, more than tears, more than words that cut like glass? There is something ancient, something archetypal in the pause of the feminine voice that unsettles the masculine heart. For centuries, men have been trained to conquer, to pursue, to speak louder than the storm. Yet what truly unravels him is not your argument, nor your fire, but the quiet withdrawal of your presence. In that space of absence, his own unconscious awakens, and he becomes haunted by shadows he cannot name. Carl Jung taught that what we resist the most often becomes what possesses us. When a man encounters a woman's silence, he is not merely dealing with a moment of stillness. He is confronting a mirror of his own psyche. Her quiet becomes the stage where his hidden fears, his neglected wounds, his unacknowledged needs come alive. He is no longer hearing her. He is hearing himself. Echoes of abandonment, whispers of rejection, the restless murmur of his shadow. Silence, then, is not emptiness. It is a living presence, an energy that takes form in the imagination of the man who cannot control it. This is the first sign of possession. His thoughts begin to circle obsessively. He wonders why she no longer speaks, why her energy has turned away. He tells himself stories in the dead of night, searching for reasons, fabricating explanations. Her silence becomes louder than her voice ever was. The Stoics believed that nothing outside of oneself could disturb the soul unless one allowed it. Yet here he is, undone, unmoored, restless. He cannot stop thinking about her because he is no longer thinking about her at all. He is thinking about himself through her. Her silence is the alchemy that exposes his dependency. The second sign is emotional dissonance. A man secretly possessed by a woman's silence will act in contradiction to himself. He may project coldness, pretending to be unaffected, yet his actions betray him. Sudden messages, strange bursts of jealousy, attempts to provoke her into breaking her quiet. He cannot tolerate the stillness because it strips away his illusion of control. Jung spoke often of projection, the unconscious tendency to place our unclaimed feelings onto another. When a woman withdraws into silence, she refuses to play in that projection field. She no longer mirrors his ego. She no longer feeds his self-importance. And so he begins to unravel, because without her reflection, he is left alone with his own distorted image. The third sign is the awakening of longing cloaked in pride. The man may convince himself that he is free, that her silence means nothing, yet deep within he feels the gnawing hunger of absence. Silence does not end desire. It magnifies it. When words vanish, imagination multiplies. He remembers her gestures, her laugh, her softness. The feminine energy, now withheld, becomes sacred in his mind. He may resist the admission, for the masculine ego despises dependence, but the longing grows like a vine around his heart. It tightens with each day she remains untouchable. You may not realize the magnitude of your silence. You may think it is a small act, a shield of dignity, or simply the refusal to waste breath where it no longer bears fruit. Yet to him it is a storm cloaked in calm. He feels it as abandonment, as rejection, as mystery. And mystery is the most dangerous force in attraction. Men are not undone by what they understand. They are undone by what they cannot explain. The fourth sign emerges in his attempts to reclaim control. He may test you, provoke you, even retreat into his own silence as a weapon. But his silence lacks the feminine's depth. The masculine silence is defensive, a fortress built out of fear. The feminine silence is magnetic, fertile, an energy that draws rather than pushes. He senses the difference. He feels it in his bones, though he cannot name it. His attempts to resist only deepen his obsession. For the more he withholds, the more he is reminded of what he cannot command, her inner world. And finally, the fifth sign of possession is the transformation of his perception. He begins to see her not as she is, but as an archetype. She becomes the unattainable, the muse, the goddess, the lost mother, the phantom that lingers in his dreams. This is the most dangerous possession of all, for now she is no longer a woman in his eyes, she is his unconscious given form. Jung called this anima projection. The man sees in her the embodiment of all that he has suppressed within himself. Her silence awakens this projection, and he cannot escape. The more she withholds, the more sacred and terrifying she becomes. And so silence is not merely an absence of words. It is a force of transformation, a mirror of shadows, a test of a man's soul. It reveals where he is bound, where he is still a prisoner of his own psyche. To the woman who wields it not as manipulation, but as truth, silence is power. For it forces the masculine to confront what he cannot escape, himself. There's a strange irony in the way men respond to silence. On the surface, they seem to crave freedom, autonomy, the ability to roam without question. Yet when a woman withdraws her voice, when she no longer invests her energy into his world, that very freedom becomes unbearable. His psyche does not experience it as liberation, but as exile. Jung often spoke of the tension between the conscious ego and the unconscious, the way the ego clings to certainty while the unconscious thrives on mystery. Silence is the wedge that opens this tension, tearing apart the illusion of control. For the man who is secretly possessed, silence becomes an intoxicating torment. He feels her absence as a weight in his chest, a hollowness that no distraction can fill. He may run to the comfort of other women, the noise of friends, the false medicine of work or ambition, but still her silence follows him like a ghost. It is in the gaps between his conversations, in the pause before he falls asleep. He cannot quiet the image of her, not because she is speaking, but because she has chosen not to. And choice is power. A woman's refusal to explain herself leaves him cornered in the labyrinth of his own mind. Here is where obsession festers. Obsession does not begin with love. It begins with uncertainty. When he cannot define her silence, he becomes enslaved to it. The masculine ego thrives on certainty, the assurance that she wants him, the clarity of her intentions, the predictability of her responses. When she denies him this, he spirals inward, creating stories, attaching meaning to every fragment of her absence. This is why silence is never neutral to the unprepared man. It is either a mirror that matures him or a riddle that destroys him. The ancient Stoics taught that control over the passions begins with control over one's interpretations. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that events are not the problem, but the judgments we place upon them. Yet a man in the grip of a woman's silence cannot apply this wisdom easily. His judgment is clouded by the wound of abandonment. For most men, silence does not simply mean quiet. It awakens the memory of every past rejection, every early wound of not being enough. He may not realize it consciously, but her withdrawal speaks to the abandoned child within him. And it is this inner child who panics, who grasps, who obsesses. For the woman, understanding this dynamic is not about cruelty or manipulation. It is about recognition of her archetypal power. The feminine has always held sway through presence and withdrawal, through mystery and revelation. Words can argue, persuade, justify. But silence compels him to face himself. If he has not integrated his shadow, he will project it onto her absence. He may accuse her of cruelty, coldness, arrogance, yet in truth he is describing the voices within him that have long gone unheard. Silence, then, is initiation. It invites the masculine to confront his shadow. Will he lash out, seeking control, demanding answers? Or will he step inward, questioning why her absence feels so unbearable? This is the line between regression and transformation. Jung described individuation as the process of reconciling the opposites within oneself, masculine and feminine, light and dark, conscious and unconscious. A woman's silence becomes the catalyst for this reconciliation, if he dares to accept it. You may notice this in his behavior. The restless checking of his phone, the the sudden appearances in your life, the way he hovers in your orbit without explanation. He may become jealous without cause, or try to provoke a reaction from you with small cruelties. He is possessed, not by you, but by the part of himself that her silence has awakened. To be possessed in the Jungian sense is to be taken over by an archetype, a force larger than the ego. In this case, it is the archetype of the abandoned lover, the rejected child, the desperate pursuer. He wears its mask without knowing it, and in doing so reveals the fragility of his control. For you, there is a temptation to break the silence, to comfort, to reassure. But to do so prematurely is to rob him of the confrontation with his shadow. The silence is not punishment. It is sacred space. It is the crucible where he must either collapse into obsession or awaken into awareness. Only by allowing him to wrestle with the silence does he discover whether his desire is rooted in ego or in truth. What makes this dynamic so dangerous and so alluring is that silence does not tell him what to think. It forces him to think. It compels him to reveal himself, not to you, but to himself. In the absence of your words, he hears the loudest voice of all, the one he has long ignored. And for many men, this confrontation feels unbearable. Yet for those who dare to endure it, it is the beginning of transformation. There is a hidden violence in silence, not the violence of aggression, but of exposure. When a woman withdraws her words, she does not merely withhold sound, she removes the veil that shields a man from his own reflection. Suddenly he is left without distraction, forced to see himself in the raw, without the balm of her laughter, her explanations, her reassurances. And this is where his possession deepens. For silence strips away illusion more ruthlessly than truth ever could. The man who once believed he held power over her may now find himself trembling at the thought of her indifference. Her silence becomes an unbearable mirror. It whispers that she does not need him, that her world continues without his presence, that she exists in a realm beyond his control. This realization threatens the very foundation of his ego. Jung spoke of the ego as a fragile construction, desperate to sustain its illusion of mastery. Yet silence is the crack that exposes the ego's weakness. In her quiet, the man discovers a truth he has long avoided, that he is not the center of her universe. This confrontation is where his longing mutates into obsession. He begins to magnify every memory of her, the way she once looked at him, the softness of her touch, the cadence of her voice. The feminine, now absent, becomes magnified in his imagination. Desire always expands in scarcity. The less he hears from her, the louder her presence grows within him. Her silence transforms her into a myth, a figure larger than life, a woman both feared and adored. She ceases to be flesh and bone. She becomes anima, the feminine soul image that Jung described, haunting him with visions of what he craves but cannot possess. And yet, her silence does more than draw him back toward her. It draws him inward. For the man who dares to confront this state honestly, silence becomes a teacher. It whispers lessons he has long avoided. His fear of being forgotten, his dependence on her validation, his lack of sovereignty. To realize that one's sense of worth has been tied to another's response is a painful revelation. Yet pain is the gateway to individuation. The Stoics reminded us that difficulty is not a curse but a training ground. Epictetus wrote that events do not break men, it is their judgments about them that wound the soul. In this way, a woman's silence becomes the forge where he either hardens into bitterness or softens into wisdom. But most men resist this transformation. Instead of embracing the discomfort, they fight against it. He may attempt to regain her attention through sudden gestures, grand or petty. Perhaps he sends a late-night message, masked as casual curiosity. Perhaps he flaunts his distractions, hoping jealousy will shatter her composure. Perhaps he disappears himself, trying to convince both her and his ego that he no longer cares. Yet beneath every tactic lies the same truth. Her silence governs him. He revolves around the very absence he pretends to ignore. For the woman, this is where awareness becomes power. To speak prematurely is to dissolve the spell. Words return him to the surface, to the safety of rational exchange. Silence, however, holds him in the depths, forcing him to wrestle with his own psyche. It is not cruelty, it is initiation. To remain silent is to refuse the role of mothering his insecurities, to let him stand before his own abyss without rescuing him. This is not the silence of apathy but of strength, the silence of a woman who knows her worth, who refuses to beg for recognition. And here lies the paradox that men rarely admit. What they find unbearable in her silence is also what makes her irresistible. Mystery intensifies desire. Distance creates gravity. The more she retreats into her sovereign stillness, the more he feels her presence magnified. It is not that silence makes her cold. It makes her infinite. She is no longer confined to the role he tried to place her in. Lover, caretaker, companion. She becomes untouchable, dwelling in a realm he cannot enter without transforming himself. And this is why he is possessed, because her silence has dethroned him from the illusion of mastery and placed him in the vulnerable posture of longing. If he dares to face this silence fully, something extraordinary can happen. He may begin to ask not, "Why is she silent?" but, "Why do I fear silence at all?" And in this shift, he touches the edge of individuation. He realizes that his worth cannot depend on her voice, that his obsession with her absence is a reflection of his unfinished self. Few men reach this point. Most remain restless, circling, trying to fill the void with distraction. But the rare man who listens to the silence, who allows it to reshape him, begins to understand the true nature of love, that it cannot be possessed, only honored. Thus, the woman's silence becomes both a test and a revelation. It reveals who he is when he cannot control, when he cannot demand, when he cannot rely on her to soothe his fragile ego. And in that revelation, his mask slips. She does not need to unmask him. Her silence does it for her. Silence has always been the feminine's oldest weapon and deepest sanctuary. Unlike anger, which is visible, or tears, which beg for empathy, silence offers no entry point. It is impenetrable. A man cannot argue with it, cannot soothe it, cannot predict its rhythm. He is left standing before a closed door, and in his frustration, he discovers the limits of his influence. Jung warned that what the ego cannot control, it demonizes. And this is often what happens when a man confronts a woman's refusal to speak. He begins to label her distance as cruelty, her restraint as manipulation, her mystery as arrogance. But what he condemns is not her silence. It is his own powerlessness in the face of it. This powerlessness is where his possession deepens. He senses that something invisible has shifted. The woman who once made herself available, who once explained and justified, has stepped out of the archetype of the giver and into the sovereign role of the withholder. And this unnerves him more than any sharp words could. For silence tells him something words never can, that she does not need to prove, persuade, or plead. She has claimed the authority of absence. And authority frightens those who are used to control. As his inner restlessness grows, he may oscillate between anger and longing. One moment, he convinces himself that he no longer cares, that she is irrelevant, that her silence means nothing. Yet in the very next breath, he feels the gnawing emptiness that her quiet has created. This is the paradox of silence. It both erases and engraves. It removes her from his daily life, yet etches her deeper into his unconscious. Jung spoke of the psyche's tendency to inflate what is denied. What is inaccessible becomes sacred. What is withheld becomes holy. Her silence transforms her into something beyond reach, and this inaccessibility fuels his obsession. Notice how his behaviors betray him. The longer her silence endures, the more extreme his attempts to break it become. Perhaps he crafts carefully worded messages, pretending indifference while secretly begging for response. Perhaps he grows reckless, staging encounters or engineering moments where she must acknowledge him. Or perhaps he collapses into despair, haunted by the sense that he has lost not just her words, but her soul. Yet all of this movement reveals the same truth. Silence governs him. She does nothing, yet he revolves around her absence like a planet bound to an unseen gravity. For the woman, this is the moment where temptation rises. To break the silence, to soothe his unrest, feels easier than maintaining the stillness. After all, the feminine is instinctively nurturing, inclined to heal, but to give in prematurely is to dissolve the crucible. Silence must be endured long enough to reveal its purpose. It is not merely about withholding words, it is about maintaining the mirror that forces him to face himself. If she rescues him, he will not grow. If she holds steady, he must either confront his shadow or flee from it. It is important to understand that silence does not harm him. It exposes him. The wound he feels is not inflicted by her. It is the echo of wounds he has long carried, the unhealed abandonment of childhood, the fear of being unseen, the terror of irrelevance. In this way, her silence is not punishment but revelation. It reveals where he is still chained, where he has not yet become whole. And this is why some men cannot endure it, because silence asks them to look into the abyss of their own soul, and not all are willing to see. For those who do endure, silence becomes initiation. A man who allows himself to sit with her absence without lashing out, without demanding, without numbing the ache, begins to mature. He learns to generate his own sense of worth, no longer dependent on her attention. He begins to see that what he craves in her is a reflection of what he must awaken in himself: tenderness, mystery, connection to the soul. Jung would call this the beginning of individuation. The man ceases to chase the feminine outside and begins to integrate her within. This is the hidden gift of silence. It is not a weapon meant to wound, but a mirror meant to awaken. It forces both the man and the woman to confront their own roles. For her, silence becomes a declaration of sovereignty, a refusal to play the endless game of explanation. For him, silence becomes a mirror of his shadow, a confrontation with his dependence and desire. It is a dance of absence and longing, of distance and discovery. And yet, silence is not eternal. It does not need to last forever to do its work. Its purpose is not to destroy connection, but to transform it. Whether the man rises to meet the challenge or collapses beneath it is not hers to decide. Her task is only to remain true to herself, to honor her inner stillness, to refuse to trade her power for his comfort. For in the end, the feminine silence is not about him at all. It is about her return to herself, her refusal to be consumed by the endless hunger of the masculine ego. And this is the final paradox. The more she embodies this silence, the more he hungers for her. But by the time he realizes it, she may already have transcended the need for his recognition.
What is most unsettling to the masculine psyche is not simply the absence of her voice, but the revelation that her silence is not emptiness at all. It is full of mystery, full of meaning, full of power he cannot decipher. In silence she becomes untouchable, unmeasurable, infinite. The woman who no longer explains herself steps out of his narrative and into her own myth. And the man, who once felt certain of her place in his life, suddenly finds himself on unfamiliar ground, stripped of the familiar reassurance of her presence. This shift awakens a deeper truth. Silence is the language of detachment. Detachment is not coldness, nor is it cruelty. It is the recognition that her worth is not dependent on his acknowledgement. In silence, she claims her sovereignty. Jung spoke often of individuation as the path toward wholeness, the integration of all parts of the psyche into a self, no longer ruled by projection. A woman's silence is a step into her own individuation. She no longer seeks validation in his attention. She no longer defines herself by his approval. Instead, she chooses herself, and this choice reverberates within him as loss. Even when she has not left his side, the possessed man feels this detachment as abandonment. His ego resists it violently. The unconscious begins to flood him with visions, fears, memories. Every unhealed wound surfaces. He feels betrayed, though no betrayal has occurred. He feels punished, though no crime has been committed. In truth, he is not being abandoned. He is being confronted with the raw fact of his dependency. It is not her silence that torments him, but the emptiness it reveals within himself. At this stage, his actions may become more desperate. He may attempt to provoke her anger, for even rage feels safer than indifference. Anger still ties her to him. Silence severs the cord. He may stage scenes to force a response, or he may disappear himself hoping she will chase him. Yet each attempt reveals the same pattern. He is no longer sovereign. He is orbiting her absence. Possession means he cannot break free, no matter what mask he wears. Even in his defiance, she governs his inner world. But here lies a subtle and dangerous truth. Silence not only reveals his dependence, it also awakens his reverence. For the man who is spiritually attuned, her silence becomes a portal into something larger than personal desire. He begins to perceive her as more than a woman. She becomes an archetype, a reflection of the eternal feminine. Jung called this the anima, the inner feminine soul image that lives in every man. When she withholds her words, he projects this anima upon her. She becomes the muse, the goddess, the unreachable one. And in this transformation, his attraction deepens beyond logic, beyond reason. He is drawn not just to her body, but to the mystery she embodies. For the woman, this is both power and danger. Power, because her silence elevates her in his psyche to the realm of myth. Danger, because men who project the anima often fail to see the real woman before them. They worship the projection, not the person. If she allows herself to be consumed by this projection, she becomes trapped in his fantasy. But if she holds her silence as sovereignty, she resists the temptation to reduce herself to his dream. She remains grounded in her own reality, untouchable by his illusions. Silence, then, is both a weapon and a sanctuary. It protects her from being consumed by the endless demands of his ego. It shields her from the role of caretaker, mother, or savior, and it grants her the space to return to herself, to hear her own inner voice more clearly than his. This is the essence of feminine power, not in domination, not in argument, but in the quiet refusal to surrender her sovereignty for his comfort. For the man, the question becomes whether he can endure this silence without collapsing into obsession. Can he use it as a mirror to confront his wounds? Can he let it refine him rather than enslave him? Few do. Most recoil, demanding answers, trying to reclaim control. But the rare man who accepts the silence as a teacher discovers a profound initiation. He learns to generate within himself what he once demanded from her. He learns that silence is not the absence of love, but the presence of truth. And for the woman, the journey through silence is equally transformative. In withholding words, she learns that she loses nothing. She discovers that her value does not diminish in quiet. It expands. She learns that the power of attraction is not always in giving, but in withholding. She realizes that the greatest magnetism lies not in proving, but in embodying the mystery that cannot be explained. The dignity that does not bend, the feminine energy that thrives in detachment. Thus, silence is no longer merely a tactic. It becomes an archetype of its own. The dark feminine, the untouchable presence, the mirror of shadows. To embody this archetype is to wield a power that is not about control, but about alignment. She does not seek to manipulate him, but to remain true to herself. In doing so, She forces him to choose, either to collapse into his obsession or to rise into his own wholeness. And this is the final truth silence reveals. The woman who no longer needs to be heard becomes unforgettable, for in her quiet, she awakens the loudest voice of all, the one within him. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.